all these people looking at his private joy. This boat has actually done, he was just telling me, it's done 5 arcs, and he's done 4 of them. So it's certainly been there and done it and got the ticket and got the t-shirt, this boat. And it's a really good example of a blue water cruising boat. Now, what I want to do is just take you through some of the things we look at when we do the pre-departure safety checks in Las Palmas. And as Jeremy touched on, the idea of the safety check is not to stand there with a clipboard, although we do have one, I'm afraid, otherwise we forget what we've checked. But it's not to examine you and tut-tut. The idea really is to just make sure that you have got everything that you should have, and also offer you a little bit of advice if you want it, and any other extra ideas we see as we go around. So we try and make it a little bit of a helpful session rather than blimey, somebody's going to want to check my boat, which is always a difficult one. So most people hopefully come away from it having learnt a little bit and feel a little bit more comfortable. And sometimes we learn something as well, because the experience of some of the guys doing the ARC and doing other events is immense, so we pick up stuff as well. So it's a kind of a two-way process sometimes. Now when we do the checks, we go through with a checklist that looks a little bit like this, and that's what I'm going to do today. It's a little bit unusual today because what I'd normally do is start on deck, go around the upper decks, and then we'd end up going down below and going through all the stuff down below, including things like stoves and so on. Clearly we can't, Hamish wouldn't appreciate us all trying to have how many people can we get on a Moody competition. So I'm just going to have to sort of point to various things on deck rather than actually take you down below, okay? But what we'd normally do is start on deck, and we'd start up at the bow. And so if I wander up there, hopefully I won't trip over my microphone cable. Okay, and what we're looking for primarily is that the boat has got adequate lifelines all the way around, so guard wires the entire length of the deck. And again, that's something you may want to consider when you're buying a yacht. We have seen a few yachts on events recently where they've had quite big open sections at the bow, quite easy for people to fall through. They haven't had lifelines going the entire way around, so that's something to look at. We do also take a quick cursory look at the rigging on the lifelines, and one of the most common things we see is key rings and split pins and the like actually coming out or not there at all. My able assistant's actually going to trail my cable around. That's going to be a bit easier. Thank you very much, Chris. So it's worth just making sure all your key rings are in place and everything is taped over and nice and secure. But you'd be amazed how many times, I reckon 1 in 5 boats I check, we find the pins missing and they go, blimey, I've just sailed down from Gibraltar like this. So it's not uncommon. Whilst we're up here, we check what navigation lights you've got. And one of the requirements, there's a full set of rules which you'll get sent, but one of the requirements is that you have 2 independent sets of navigation lights. And to all intents and purposes, that will really mean for most people having a lower set of nav lights, so a bicolour at the bow and a stern light, and then a tricolour at the masthead. Now, in terms of power consideration, have a good think when you're kitting your boat out about the type of lights you want. We've seen an increasing move over to LED lights in recent years, and I'd certainly urge you to have a look at that. A, the power consumption is much less, and B, they're an awful lot more reliable in actual fact. We have fewer problems with LED lights than we do the traditional incandescent bulbs.
Rob, can I just add right at that? If you're going to change to LEDs, you need to change the whole fitting. Don't retrofit a bulb into an existing fitting. That's asking for trouble. You have to change the whole fitting to a purpose-designed LED light.
Okay, thanks Jeremy. So yeah, just check you have 2 independent sets of navigation lights, which we have on this boat here. Now, while I'm stood here, I'll also just be casting an eye aloft and seeing what type of radar reflector you've got. And one of the requirements is that you have a radar reflector with an RCS of 10 square metres. That stands for radar cross-section. Sounds very technical. If you're not sure, look in your manual. What I can say is this type of reflector, an Echo Max or a Ferdell Blipper, will be in excess of, or most likely will be in excess of an RCS of 10. The ones that we don't accept, he says looking around to see if I can find one, but you may see them around marinas, are the very small tubular ones you may see, look like a bit like a bird feeder. those have an RCS of about 2. They're stealth reflectors, we call them. There was an incident many years ago with a vessel, yacht that was hit by a large ship in the English Channel, and sadly all the guys were lost. But as the upshot of that, they did a huge investigation into the effectiveness of radar reflectors, because the ship never saw the sailing boat. And it turned out that a lot of reflectors don't work particularly well on yachts, even less so when the yacht is heeled, but those bird feeder ones are next to useless, so we don't accept those. What we do see now as well, though, is a lot of the active radar reflectors, the CMEs and like, and certainly you can have those, but you must also have a passive reflector, one that doesn't rely on electricity, such as this one as well, okay? Because if your power fails, then you're fairly invisible. Right. Those active ones are really good though. You know, they can push your RCS up to 35 or more, and they give a nice, strong, consistent signal as well. And that's really what a ship needs for its ARPA system to lock on. So well worth thinking about if you're going offshore. So that's radar reflectors. Now the other thing we also look for up here is attachment points for the jackstays. Now, Chris, I think there's some jackstays rolled up on the deck there next to the life. You can just hold those up. Quite wisely, these have been taken off the boat, and there's a good reason for taking them off when you're not using your boat, particularly in areas like the Caribbean or areas near the equator. They suffer hugely from UV degradation. So when you're not using them in the Caribbean, take them off and put them away. The same if you leave your boat in Las Palmas and fly home for a few months, get rid of the jackstays. If you're not sure, get the expert opinion from a rigger. But if you just run your thumbnail up and down the fibre of the jackstay and you start getting lots of little bits of fluff coming off, there's a very good chance that they've had their life. And certainly anyone that's over 7 years old is more than likely had its life. So I think the thing to consider is, would you be happy hanging off the end of one? That's the thing I always ask. Now on the subject of jackstays, it's also when you're buying your boat or kitting your boat out, have a think about where the jackstays are attaching. They should be the full length of the yacht, so from the bow to the stern. That isn't always the case on some boats that I see. And quite often we see jackstays attached to cleats. And one of the downside of attaching it to a cleat is that when you have mooring lines on top of the jackstay, it tends to rub. And we quite often see jackstays that are almost worn through because the mooring lines have been rubbing through the jackstay. So the ideal solution really is to actually have a dedicated pad eye in your deck for your jackstays with one of those adjuster plates that can adjust the length of the jackstay. That's really the ideal attachment. Okay. Moving aft now, so we've pretty much finished up here. We'll start going back down here towards the life raft, and Jeremy mentioned life rafts earlier. Able assistant will take my cable. Now I guess the first thing to say about life rafts is consider perhaps where you're going to locate the life raft. And some of you may well have been aware of the cheeky Rafiki accident, which is obviously in everybody's mind at the moment. I think it was 1 year on yesterday. And one of the interesting bits of information from the investigation branch was the message about considering where you do locate your life raft. It's a very difficult subject. It's almost, there is no perfect solution as to where you man your life raft. Certainly to cope with a keel loss, which is a very rare event, it's going to happen very quickly. And you know, unless your life raft is mounted clear of the stern on the push bit there, then you're going to struggle to get to it. Certainly when the boat is turned over, it's definitely a very difficult subject. If you are going to mount it on the push bit, certainly it's a lot of people's favourite because it tends to be a little bit easier to launch if there's just two of you and one of you is not as well built as the other one. To try and drag a life raft out of a locker is obviously, particularly if it's down below or in a cockpit locker, is a very hard thing to do. If it's mounted on the push pit, then you can, with a quick release mechanism, just launch it over the stern of the vessel. So it has got its upsides. The downsides are that a lot of modern boats, the fittings aren't really up to it. If you have a look at the rail on the push pit, the fittings can be quite weak. And certainly we had a boat in our fleet where we mounted the life raft on the push pit, and within weeks the legs were starting to bend. Now, what would have happened if a wave had washed over? It would have ripped the life raft off, clear of the push pit. So you may, if you're going to do that, just check that the push bit is up to it, and also, you know, consider maybe reinforcing the push bit legs or the bracing underneath. But that's really an important point to consider. Another option is to mount it on deck midships, as we have here, so on the coach roof, and this is a really, again, a good option. What I quite like about this is it's not actually central, it's actually a little bit nearer, it's offset, so it's a little bit nearer to the guard wires here, so it's a little bit easier to launch over the side of the boat. So that's quite a nice solution as well. Cockpit locker, I would say, is probably the last option. One of the rules is that you can get your launch within 15 seconds. From a cockpit locker, that can be quite hard sometimes. The other thing we've seen, if you do keep your valise life raft in a cockpit locker, when they're serviced, they're packed very tight, and you put them into your cockpit locker, and what can happen over a period of time is the bag starts to grow in size, it starts to expand. And I've had the occasion in Las Palmas where I've asked the crew to grab their life raft out. Guess what? They couldn't get it out of the cockpit locker. It's happened to me twice. So, you know, another consideration for you. We see here this one's got a padlock on. I know it sounds obvious, but you know, it's a good idea to have a padlock on these, particularly if you're going to more remote parts of the world, but do remember to take it off before you go sailing. If you're going to fit a hydrostatic release unit onto your life raft, and does everybody know what I mean? So hydrostatic release means that if you're unable to launch the raft, if the vessel sinks, the hydrostatic release will operate and free the life raft from its lashings and allow it to rise to the surface and then inflate, and then a weak link breaks and float away from the boat as it sinks. The downside, well, it's not really a downside if you read the instructions, but what we do see is probably half of the hydrostatic units we see fitted have been rigged incorrectly. So if the vessel sunk, it wouldn't actually release the life raft, it would take the life raft down with the vessel, which is not very helpful, or something would break anyhow. So do have a look at that. There's some very good instructions online about how to set up hydrostatic release units. Now the life raft itself, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, needs to be one of a couple of different types of specification. For most purposes nowadays, you're probably going to be looking at what's called an ISO 9650 specification. And the ISO specification came about really as a result of all the findings from the Sydney Hobart disaster. In actual fact, there was something called an ISAF raft that was launched before that. We do also accept an ISAF specification, but that was only ever really an interim measure. The ISO is really what you'll find in the chandleries now if you're going to buy a new one. And some of the advantages of the ISO raft is that they've done extensive testing, they've got good boarding systems, so a proper chute or a boarding platform to get on. They have been, got great ballast bags underneath, so they're the bags that fill with water and stop the raft tipping over. So they have minimum specification for the size of the ballast bags. The material has been tested, so it won't just disintegrate. These are all problems that happened in the Sydney Hobart, and more so in the Fastnet disaster before. So the ISO specification is a great spec. However, a word of caution, it is a self-certifying specification. So the manufacturers just put their hands up and say, yes, we have built it to this. And not all ISOs are necessarily equal. So again, go and talk to a good equipment supplier, such as Ocean Safety, who work closely with World Cruising Club, and talk through the different types of rafts. But it must be an ISO 9650 specification. There are two types of ISO 9650 raft. There's a Type 1 and a Type 2. And you'll see the numbers quite often on the raft. There's a little label on the raft here, and you can just see on this one it says ISO 9650-1. Very small number 1. If it says -2, that's a coastal raft and it's no good. And it's really sad. In Las Palmas last year we had 4 people turn up who had just bought these on the internet and thought, just saw ISO 9650, that's fine. Spent £2,000 or whatever it was, and then we had to say, I'm sorry, bad news, it's a coastal raft, it's not an offshore raft. So it needs to be a Type 1 offshore. Okay, so again, a little sort of hint for you. The ISO raft comes with 2 equipment packs as well. So you will have the option of a less than 24-hour pack or a more than 24-hour pack. And clearly for the types of trips that you'll be doing with World Cruising Club, you require more than 24-hour equipment pack. So again, it's worth checking that. Sometimes the extra bits will be packed inside, and normally the extra bits in the more than 24-hour will be things such as water, food rations, and some extra flares. Okay. quite often the manufacturer may give you a grab bag though to make their raft up from a less than 24 hour to more than 24 hour. I'm not a massive fan of that. I think I'd rather have it packed in the raft, but quite often they will do it that way and give you a grab bag. So you need to make sure that's readily available as well. Just behind the grab bag there, I should mention actually, we do accept SOLAS rafts as well. SOLAS is a commercial standard, so it tends to be, well, A, very expensive, and B, very heavy, which isn't always the first choice for cruisers or offshore racers, certainly. But they're great rafts, and we do accept that, but it will have to have what's called an A pack, which is, again, an offshore equipment pack. Now, talking about the contents of a life raft, just behind the life raft there, you can probably see the grab bag. Now, the first thing to consider really is where you're going to keep the grab bag. And I was just having a chat with Hamish about that earlier, and he made the very useful point that there's little point having your grab bag tucked down below in something like the forepeak. Well, we have seen it before. If you've got a fire, you won't be able to get down below. So think about where you're going to place your grab bag. There's no right or wrong answer, but you need to be happy you can grab it really quickly and get off the boat quickly with it. What you're going to put in the grab bag is, to a large extent, going to depend on what you already have in your life raft. And again, people are quite surprised when you point out that their raft may not have through the water necessarily. So have a really good look through your life raft equipment pack. If you get the opportunity, go and see a life raft being serviced. Again, Ocean Safety will allow you to do this. It's a real eye-opener, and you can see what equipment you have inside. It's not a huge amount. It's enough for just basic survival. So the grab bag is an opportunity to pack some extra items in that are going to make your life a little bit more bearable. Probably the most important things to go in the grab bag are what we call location items. So these are things that are going to help you get located. Top of the list will probably be the EPIRB, okay? But you may also want to, perhaps if you have a SART, search and rescue transponder, that's a good bit of kit to put in there. You'll also, if you see a ship, want to tell them that you're there. So maybe a VHF radio, be quite useful, a handheld one, and a handheld GPS, so you can give your position to another ship. So those are good ideas to put in the grab bag. It's worth also augmenting the grab bag with extra food and water. The amount of water you get in the life raft, even with a more than 24-hour pack, is only about an additional litre-and-a-half per person. So it's not much, and particularly in a tropical climate. So take some extra water. Don't fill the bottles right up though. Have it about 80% full. Then if you drop them in the water, they float. Okay. So quite a lot of guys will have some water next to the grab bag in the cockpit locker, ready to go. If you've got life raft rations in your life raft, it will do the job, but it's pretty grim. It's like eating cardboard. So you're having a bad day anyhow. Why not put some extra things in your grab bag that are going to cheer things up a little bit? So maybe some little bit of chocolate. Really, anything that's high carbohydrate is good. Okay, try and avoid high protein foods because your body uses water when it processes protein foods. Other things that are quite useful are sun cream. Somebody's got to have their head poked out through the hatch in the life raft, so have some sun cream. Have a hat, a baseball cap. You're going to get a huge amount of exposure in the life raft. You haven't got the benefit of a bimini. So, that's going to be really crucial as well. Okay. So that's really grab bags. Moving on back here, we're going to go, I think what we'll do now is move slightly aft to the back of the boat. Has anybody got any questions on the life rafts before I move on? Because it is quite a big asking point, really. We're all happy on that. Okay, that is one of the most common questions I think the guys in the office and Cal certainly get asked about is life rafts. So.
Can I ask, is it also quite common for a big mistake is that you have a life raft for too many people?
Yeah,
Makes it less stable when it's...
The question there was, is it a mistake to have a life raft that's too big for the number of people on board? Simple answer is yes, it can be. The modern life rafts, because of the extra size of the buoyancy bags underneath, ballast bags, sorry, are inherently much more stable than the old ORC rafts were 10, 15 years ago. But certainly I would think twice about having maybe 2 people in a 10-man raft, because the people in the raft do constitute some of the stability of the raft. And the idea is you'll evenly space out around the inside of the raft to give it stability as well. There's no laid down number. There's no rule saying you must have more than 50% of the capacity of the life raft, but that's probably a fairly good place to start from. The other thing I didn't mention on grab bags is if you have any personal medication, then put that into your grab bag as well. Ship's papers, passports. People have been rescued and thought that's the end of their trouble, and actually, because they can't produce a passport, believe it or not, they've then had an awful time trying to get into the country they've been rescued by, or out of the country they've been rescued by. So personal medication as well, you can get packed into the actual life raft when you get it serviced. That's definitely worth considering. The other requirements on the Ark is for some man overboard equipment. So generally on the check, we'd start to move back along the boat, all the way I'll be checking the guide wires, checking the pins are in place, checking they're solid, they're not going to fall over. And then coming towards the stern of the boat, we'll be looking at the man overboard equipment. Now we can see on Hamish's boat here, we've got two life rings here. And one of them has a dam buoy attached, so the large pole there with a flag. And that's perfect. So that is acceptable. There are a couple of different combinations you can have. You can, instead of having the life buoy there and the pole, you can have an MOB module, so like a John buoy. Okay. So the rules do contain about 6 different combinations of things you can have. The important thing I would say here is that when you buy these, they tend not to come always with retroreflective tape. They don't come with, quite often or normally, with little drogues on. So you can probably, well, it's quite hard to see, but the guys down here will be able to see there's a little drogue, like a mini drogue, attached. And the idea of that is, of course, when it's in the water, it's not skidding and blowing away from the man in the water as he's trying to swim towards it. It gives it some stability. And also, they require to have a whistle. Now, you can guess what 3 things people turn up without in Las Palmas. In Las Palmas, there are 250 boats, 1 small chandlery. The queue is enormous and takes hours, and people start to get very, very impatient queuing up for a whistle. I'm going to take lots of whistles with me next year, and I'm going to make a fortune. But it's worth reading the small print and just making sure that you're happy it's got everything you need. Okay. The other thing is just check it's quick to release. Again, I've been on quite a few boats where it's been lashed on so well, and I've said, well, man overboard, throw the gear, and it's taken about 10 minutes to throw the gear, by which time you're in the next island. And well, why have you done that? Oh, because it keeps falling off. Or, you know. So just make sure it's easy to deploy, and think about which one you deploy first. The other requirement is for, and it's quite hard to see here, but it's a man overboard. Actually, I don't know, Chris, you might be able to retrieve it from the rail, the sling on this starboard quarter. So is a man overboard sling. The idea of the sling is that it's attached to the vessel with a long bit of polyprop floating line, and it's like a helicopter harness, and you could deploy this and then circle around, entrap your man overboard, and then pull him back alongside, and actually use then the strop to actually pull him back on board. Okay. Again, this needs a whistle and a light. They never come with whistles or lights. Never. I've never seen one. And people say, why do I need a light on it? Well, if you're towing it around at night, how are you going to see where it is? Okay, so a simple little thing. Man overboard is something I know Mob Map may be looking at later, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. But we do talk to the crew on board and yourself about how you would cope. Well, firstly, when you clip on, quite importantly, prevention is always better, isn't it? But should the worst happen, how would you go about recovering somebody? And again, there's no right or wrong method. What I can say is they're all quite difficult, and they will all, the method you use will depend on the type of the boat, the freeboard, the strength of the crew, the health of the victim in the sea, and so on. There's lots of factors. Sometimes, though, something as simple as a boarding ladder at the stern, if it's flat calm and the stern's not moving, might work. Great to see we've got a boarding ladder on the side here, so maybe have a movable ladder that you can move along the side of the boat. Something as simple as a Genoa sheet over the side might work. Okay. The other option is having a what we call a handy billy. Which,
can't get off.
Oh, Chris can't get off. Not to worry. So what you can do, Chris, there's a handy billy over here. Oh, okay. You can see the man overboard sling there. Actually, should we see if it's got a light on?
It's there. I'm not turning it that way.
Well done. Fantastic. They've obviously done it. They've read the manual.
50 quid that cost.
I'm looking for my handy billy now.
It's there on the rib.
Ah, there it is actually. Sorry, Chris. Hold that up. The other thing, which is it's not a requirement, but just when we're talking to crews about man overboard recovery, is to think about maybe taking this with you. It's just a handy billy, couple of blocks made up. We have them on our training boats, all our training boats. And the idea with a snap shackle at the top, you could attach that to a spinnaker sheet, halyard, and the bottom end can have a strop on, similar to the strop that we saw in the sling there. And you can lower that over the side, and then with a 6-to-1 purchase, you can pull somebody back on board. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. So we just check you have thought about it. I guess the next thing we will check on deck before we start going below is what you have in place for emergency steering. And it's quite interesting how bad emergency steering or emergency tillers are on modern boats. Half the ones we check don't seem to fit properly. There's a huge amount of movement in the tiller. The reality is that emergency tiller is not going to steer you across the Atlantic. So going back to what I was saying before, think about how you would repair your problem if you had a broken cable. Think about your autopilot. Quite often the autopilot will be connected directly to the quadrant, so that could carry on steering for you even if you have a cable problem. The best the emergency tiller will do is stabilise the quadrant while you can actually effect some repairs. Okay. The other option though, aside from autopilot, which may get you out of trouble, is to have a wind vane such as the hydro vane has its own emergency tiller. So when you're looking at buying wind vanes, maybe ask that question, does it have an independent rudder on there? Sorry, not tiller, independent rudder, that could also act as a backup rudder. And Hamish actually has got, I don't know if you can see on the starboard quarter, which makes, sorry, is your wind vane, Hamish?
It's monitor.
It's a monitor vane, and the monitor has a similar system. It has an auxiliary rudder, which will fit onto the system there at the back and really get Hamish out of trouble if he has a steering problem. Okay? But as a minimum, we look for an emergency tiller. That's a minimum. But we do encourage you to start thinking further afield than just an emergency tiller. Steering problems are quite a major issue. A couple of other things on deck before we look at the down below items. There should be a on-deck bilge pump, so you should be able to pump the bilges from on deck. Again, when you're looking to buy a boat for an offshore passage, that may influence what you're buying. Certainly some manufacturers, I won't name and shame, but certainly Halberg Rassi, weren't keen on having on-deck bilge pumps. And we do ask for people with boats without it to come up with a solution. And the easiest solution is normally a pump attached to a bit of wood that can go into the washboard slots with a long hose that can go down below. So there are ways around it, but have a look when you're buying your boat. The handle needs to be attached, so you don't lose it over the side. It's a very simple thing. We'll also look for you to have a VHF speaker in the cockpit. So you can maintain a VHF listening watch on VHF. Okay. The reason we ask for that on deck is that traditionally, if it's only down below, people are trying to sleep and it gets turned off, and that's that. Okay, so we do have a requirement for that. Other things on deck, a couple of buckets with lanyards, very straightforward, so we can either put out fires by scooping water, or we can bail out a flooded cabin. The washboards themselves, going back to the washboards, need to have a little bit of lanyard on. Is your lanyard still on there, Hamish? Okay, you see he's got a little hole on his washboard there. So the idea is you can attach some string to that, and then in rough conditions you can then tie that to the grab rails there, for example. So should the worst happen, you're not going to lose the washboards overboard. Okay. Probably at this point, I would just now be looking at clipping on points. I've looked at the jackstays. I'm looking for clipping on points in the cockpit area, and I can see here that he's got 2 near the companionway, which is absolutely crucial. So you can clip on before you come out on deck, or before you go back below. So again, when you're looking to purchase your boat or fit out, have a little look around at all these little features. Are they present and correct? Generally, a lot of the equipment we then need to look at is down below. So we've laid out as much as we can along the decks today. And the first item here, Hamish, I don't know if you could just hold it up for me, is Hamish has got a hacksaw and lots of blades to cut the rigging. And we had a little conversation earlier. Hamish's rigging is 12 millimetres, I think?
12.
12, yeah. So it's 12 millimetre rigging. And anybody that's done, has anybody here tried to cut some rigging with bolt croppers? How easy was it or not?
You can't.
You can't, yeah. So answers ranging from you can't to, yeah. It's something we do on the ISAF course, and people can't believe how difficult it is. And that's on a day like today, in the dry, in the sunshine. When you lose your rig, the boat is all over the place. It loses any stability, and it's a horrible roll on it. So you kind of have to hold on with one hand, and then trying to use one of those bolt croppers, or wire cutters, to cut your wire rigging is very, very difficult. A hacksaw is quite a good alternative. It will mean you need lots of blades, but it will get through. If you really have got some money to spare and quite a big rig, you could look at getting hydraulic cutters, and they can be very expensive, but they will be very, very effective indeed. If you've got rod rigging, and quite large rod rigging, you're certainly going to have to consider perhaps getting battery-operated angle grinders, and that's certainly the choice of most of the bigger boats with rod rigging tend to have angle grinders on board, on battery-operated. Don't forget, if you're lucky, you might be able to knock the clevis pin out at the base of the shrouds there, depending on how the rig falls. So have a look at that. You may be able to knock those out before you start cutting the rig. So there's different options available to you. But the most important thing is you've got something on board you know will work. That's really crucial. I think we're pretty much done on deck now. So we're just going to look at some of the items traditionally we'll probably see down below. So at this point we're popped down below. One of the requirements is that heavy items on board can't move around, and as well as the anchor, so we make sure the anchor is secured, you can secure the anchor. We'll also look down below at things like the batteries. And again, you'd be really surprised how often we see batteries that aren't strapped down, okay? But it can be even the small things that really have a big effect when you're rolling. Somebody I know got knocked out by a tin of baked beans, so they were at the char table and boat rolled, came across and knocked them out. It can be something that small. So think about your stowage. Have you got plenty of cupboards, plenty of places to stow heavy kit? But specifically, we will look at the stove. We'll make sure that the gimbals are such that it gimbals freely, but the gimbals have locks on. Now, again, most modern stoves have, it's hard to describe without seeing it, it's like two safety tabs that bend over to stop the cooker being able to come out of its gimbal. Over time, they start to bend back, so I reckon half the boats we go on, we can lift the cooker out, and then people go, blimey. And it's a very simple fix, so just check that. Check, again, when you're looking to buy a boat or kit your boat out, that you've got a crash bar in front of the stove there. You know, I talked about burns earlier, so having a crash bar there so you don't career straight into the stove from one side of the boat to the other is also important. And maybe a galley strap for the chef, the cook, to brace themselves in at sea. The other thing down below we'll check is seacocks and hull openings. And I think there's some bungs down there, Chris. I mean, the easiest solution to that is bungs. I'm personally not a massive fan of actually attaching them to all the seacocks. And the reason for that is they tend, quite often people misjudge what size bung they need. So which part is broken? Is it the seacock? Is it the hose tail? You know, is it the fitting? What's broken? So they misjudge the size. But also, they're designed to swell when they get wet. And if you've got them already next to the fitting and it's flooded, they would have already swelled before you put them into the fitting. So my personal preference is to have a location plan of all my hull openings and then have a box of bungs with a hammer somewhere central that I can then go to the problem with that. But it's a personal choice. The main thing is you know where your holes are. And think about sea fittings, skin fittings that may not always be below the waterline when you're here, but when you're sailing back across the Atlantic, particularly coming back the other way and heeled over, are underwater. Okay? Think about where the rudder tube is and what would happen if you lost the rudder stock. Is that glassed up above the waterline? So think about that when you're looking at the design of your boat and how you'd sort that problem out. And maybe think about things like the prop shaft. If you lost the prop shaft, and it has happened, what are you going to put in there? So it's not just the hull openings, or the seacocks, it's every single opening on the boat. Have a good think through. The other thing we'll check down below is life jackets. And there is a requirement to have a life jacket for each person on board. And ideally, it should be an integral harness. I think, you know, in this day and age, I certainly prefer a life jacket with an integral harness rather than knowing when to wear a harness, when to wear a life jacket, and so on. But if you don't have integral harness, you will need to have separate harnesses. Now, the life jackets you tend to buy quite often typically won't come with a lot of the basics, so that you must have a light on there. and you must have a crotch strap. Was there a crotch strap on that one? Chris can hold that up. So Chris will show you the crotch strap there. One of the reasons for the crotch strap, if you've done a sea survival course, you'll know, is once you're in the water, the life jacket will, without a crotch strap, will rise up into completely the wrong position, even if you have it quite tight. And it won't support you, so your head is clear of the water. So that's the primary reason. So make sure you've got a crotch strap. You're also required to have a spray hood. And again, anybody that's done a sea survival course will know the reason for that. When you're in the water, your legs tend to act a bit like drogues, so you turn around and end up facing the oncoming waves. And for those that have done a sea survival course with the instructor throwing buckets of water over you or a hose, will know that without the spray hood, it's not a great experience. You're not going to last long. So again, don't wait till you get to Las Palmas. Okay, the spray hood the one you buy should be specific for the brand of life jacket that you've got. They do sell generic ones in Las Palmas, and all I get all day long is, can you show me how to fit it? And then it won't fit. There are lots of different life jackets, and it's important, you know, that you get the correct spray hood in the UK. It makes your life a lot easier. The other thing I'd say, just very briefly on life jackets, is get familiar with them. Open them up. Hamish here was showing me this one earlier. It's got, I think it's got 2 bottles on this one, isn't it? 2 cylinders, which is a nice little feature. Get confident, because if you're away from land for a long period of time, you need, as I was saying earlier, you need to get into the routine of checking your own kit and doing your own servicing as well to some extent if you're away for a long period. So have a look at the points where it could wear, where you can get abrasion. Check the expiry light on the batteries, for the lights, expiry date, sorry, for the battery lights. Again, that's something that gets overlooked all the time when we find the lights don't work. Blow them up manually and leave them on your table overnight and see what happens. You'd be surprised. You know, if I see a dodgy life jacket, I'll get somebody to blow it up and then come back to the boat the next day. And it's surprising how often they've gone down. So it's worth just doing that as well. But the main thing is get them serviced by a professional maybe before you head off. Okay?
Can I just say on that, the other thing we've added, you can get a floatable loop.
Yeah.
And it floats, and actually if you do unfortunately go over, it makes it easier for the other person.
It's 2 metre, it's 2 metre piece of Dyneema with a loop on the end.
Okay.
So that you can then bring them on board with that. And so
okay.
I'm hoping it's me that goes in the water, but if he does, then that's the case. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good idea.
Yeah.
It'll take about 200 kilos.
Okay.
Sorry, can you say more about this rope? I didn't understand.
I'll hand you the microphone very briefly.
Okay.
Very briefly.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the show. We recently found a website, guys. He runs one of the sailing clubs. He's developed this lanyard that you simply attach to the lifting eye on your life jacket. It's a 2 metre piece of fluorescent Dyneema with a loop on the end. And the purpose is it floats, and you can actually grab hold of it with a boat hook, then pull it up and tie the person onto a cleat, so it'll hold them in place, and then you can actually attach a handy billy or whatever to that and pull them straight up using that. If somebody's unconscious, they're not going to be able to get hold of a line and attach it to their life jacket. I think about £20 each or something. Thanks.
And he's got 10 in the boot of his car.
Plus whistles.
Okay, the other thing, thank you very much for that, thanks. This is what today's about, is sharing ideas as well. The other thing with the life jacket is obviously a safety line to clip on with. And Hamish has got a few here on his boat, so each person should have one. I think the one we got there is a 3-point one, which is great, so you don't have to unclip as you move around. Worth, again, thinking about how you clip on. There was a tragic event a few years ago now on an offshore race off the Isle of Wight where a chap died because he kind of clipped on the low side of the boat. There's a lot of factors, but one of the factors was that he clipped onto the low side of the boat rather than the upwind side of the boat. And it also had a 3-point one, but used either extremity, so it was much longer than perhaps it needed to be. Had he used the shorter bit, it would have been much more successful. And they really struggled to get him obviously back on board as he was still attached to the boat. But do have a think about where you clip on, when you clip on, and so on. Again, check them, because these are bits of kit that tend to get knocked around, dragged along the deck, left in the sunshine, and then at the end of the day we throw them in the bottom of a locker all filthy, wet and dirty, and forget about them until the next time. So if you've any suspicions, go and buy some new ones. Okay, we're getting there now, so moving on, there is a requirement for flares. I think we've got the flare canister there. So in terms of flares, we need 6 rocket flares, 4 red handhelds, and 2 orange smokes. So fairly straightforward. They should be stored in a watertight container, but perhaps more importantly, everybody should know how to use them. We do a flare demo in Las Palmas, so we have great fun and we get as many people involved as we can, actually getting hands-on with setting some flares, getting some flares set off, and it's surprising how many people have to read the instructions 20. These are their own flares sometimes 20 times, and so it's quite surprising. But there's a lot of talk at the moment about the EVDS, electronic visual distress systems, the LED or laser flares. I'm not going to get too involved in it other than say they're amazing bits of kit. I think they've got a real big place going forwards, but at the moment it's certainly only in addition to normal pyrotechnics. Okay, that may well change. Jeremy's giving indication that lunch is almost ready, so I need to rattle through the rest of this. What else have we got on deck there? There we go, so Chris is holding one up there. We're almost there actually. And last thing down below really is fire extinguishers. The requirement is actually only for 2 extinguishers. And I was actually on a boat a little while back in Scotland with Chris, funnily enough. Wasn't Chris's fault. And the cooker caught fire, which probably was my fault, because it's a paraffin cooker and I kept setting this thing on fire. But it really got out of control. And the interesting thing was, 2 of the 3 extinguishers didn't work. Luckily we had 3 on board, so the 3rd one did. And one of the reasons was the powder had compacted down in the extinguishers, a multi-purpose powder. So the top tip I learned was to, get them serviced. These weren't recently serviced, but tip them up and down. That really helps. Okay, 2 isn't enough. 2 is the minimum. I think Hamish, you've got 5 on board. 7 on board. And the point Hamish made earlier, which is a good one, is have one in the cockpit, because you may not be able to get down below to actually access the fire extinguisher. Think about having one in the engine compartment, and go for the biggest ones you can get. The small ones don't last long. We were surprised at how quickly they were exhausted. We went off to get another extinguisher. By the time we come back, the fire had erupted again. So that was another lesson, get them all together and then fight the fire. That's about it. So you would get a very long list if you entered the event, but hopefully you can see that the main thing is it's nothing more than you would probably choose otherwise to go sailing with. It's not prohibitive at all. And of course many people add to this equipment, but hopefully it's giving you a little bit of insight and things to think about when you come to buy a boat or kit it out. So I'd just like to again say thank you very much to Hamish. Round of applause for Hamish for allowing us to use his boat today. And I hope you have a great lunch. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So where do we go next?
You're no, exactly. No.
There is going to be if you want to hang on actually, Mob Mat are going to do a little bit of a demonstration, ladies and gentlemen.